distinct setups and phases with this. Setup is really part of Act 1, and then we have a tilt, Act 2, and then we have an aftermath and a montage for Act 3. But today we're going to talk about Fiasco, the setup, using dice, your game sheet categories, and given elements. The first step is you just need, for however many players you have 4 dice per player are rolled. Usually it's 2 white dice, 2 of some other color. Fiasco likes to list a default of red, but there are many other varieties of standard D6s out there. Some people like to have every single player must roll their 4 dice. Some like to just have it all just put in there, jumbled, poured out in the center. There are lots of different ways to it, but what it comes down to, you have between 3 and 5 players. Each player is responsible for 4 dice. 2 dice that are white, 2 dice that are non, and they're rolled into the center. Very simple first part, rolling dice per person. Now this is where it gets more complicated. The numbers that you have facing up from that roll, from that randomization, these are the potential options for your use of the game sheets. So game sheets are in several different things here. We've got lots of categories and elements. Categories are the big kind of piles that these different options come into. There are always 6 on a game sheet. And then there are, within a given category, another 6 elements. And you set an element and then you further define it. And in Fiasco, we have 4 basic flavors of this: relationships, needs, locations, and objects. And we're going to talk about what each of those are to you and how you want to approach these as a player to make your story more interesting, to make it something you want to be working with. So relationships is the one I want to start with because it is the most important. Relationships, far and away the most important of the 4 with this. Why this symbol for this area? Because each player makes one relationship with each neighboring player. So the player to the left of you, the player to the right of you, not a player across from you. So if you're in a group of 3, that's going to be relationships with every player. If you're going to be in a group of 4, there's at least one player that you don't have any connection with at the start of the game. Group of 5, even more so with it. But you have to be in a relationship with a player to either side of you. That is just mandatory. Now, the game sheets inherently use what's called the divider-chooser method from the idea of game theory and mathematics. Again, that idea is you take some kind of fictional resource like cake or pie or something tasty like that. One person has to divide it. The other person gets to choose between the things that are divided. Fiasco, you've got more than 2 people, so it gets a little more complicated. This comes into your categories. With the relationships, one player can set the relationship where the other defines it. So maybe you set the relationship for the player to your left and they define it. Maybe the player to your right sets the relationship and you define it. But the important thing is, with relationships, no one can set and define. It must involve choice of both players within it. So nobody can do both within it. This gives choice, but also builds engagement in your story with it. Needs. Needs are probably next important down your list. Because when you go into every scene, you should be thinking about what is your character's need or goal or want. What do they want to get out of this given moment that you're going to be writing or acting out with it? So needs right after relationships. Relationships just dictate how we work with each other. They're also going to play into some of the other parts of the setup, but needs are very important for you because they're involved in every single scene. My advice here is actually make sure you spend the dice. You should at least have a need. You should at least have the category of a need. It's okay to not define it. Some of the needs are vague enough in a given play set that it might give you enough that you think you can work with it. But you should at least have a need if it's not also defined. It's okay to have it undefined. It isn't the end of the world. It's plenty to go on in a lot of cases, especially in larger groups. If you're looking at a group of 4 or 5, very common to have multiple players with only the need not further defined in it. Here's the thing, though. Needs affect both objects and locations in terms of who gets to use them, who gets to work with them. So you should at least have it. So please make sure you are spending the dice down with it. Now, objects and locations kind of provide the general mapping of things that you're going to have within the rest of your game with it. Some people get very focused on being completionists, and they want to have everything filled out on their sheets as much as possible. You can't fill out everything. There are simply more options than you have players and characters and dice. Don't worry about that. You don't have to have both a location and an object. The problem is whatever you do have must be used. This is the idea of what's called Chekhov's gun in dramatic theory. Chekhov, being a famous Russian revolutionary playwright, said that if you introduce a gun within the first act, it must be used before the end of the show. Otherwise, this menace, this interest is thwarted, and you're just being boring to your audience. You're not being truthful to them with it. If you have an object or a location, it must be used. Now, an object especially becomes interesting because whoever sets an object and defines an object, that object then exists within that relationship between the two players. Now, this, if you're in a larger group, sometimes can come into play where an object is set by somebody at the table you don't have a relationship with, but you have the turn to be able to define it. Then you know that these two characters are going to interact at some point in the story over these stolen papers. Or these two characters are going to interact and it's going to involve a bloody knife or whatever the given object is. The objects all have some kind of hint of menace and randomness within it. So they can be a very fun thing to have going on within your game, but they exist within relationships. You don't just randomly have the object just show up in there and a random map appears. And no, it's got to exist within the relationship of characters with it. And in some cases, it helps create a relationship cue for later on in what you're doing. Now, you want to keep track of all of this with it. Use these as your guide throughout what you're doing. Always go into a scene thinking about what are the relationships I have with the other characters in this. Do I hate this person? Did this person wrong me in the past? Or does this person have something that I want? And I want to get that from them. Always go back to when you're looking at starting your scene, like what does my character need? What is my character's relationship to these other people with it? Great quote from Will Wheaton from the tabletop episode on Fiasco. He said that needs inspire, objects and locations direct. And this is a very good guideline to have for this. Your needs are a little more open-ended with it, whereas your objects or locations are going to direct the things that happens. Location, if you know that you've got to have something happen at the docks at midnight, you can build towards that. Maybe it doesn't happen in Act 1, maybe it happens in Act 2 with it. Or if it hasn't happened by the time your montage rolls around, how are the docks at midnight going to be used? This gives an air of mystery and some interest also for it. But by objects and locations having to be used, it gives you things that you can look towards with it. Whereas your relationships and needs should kind of inspire maybe more what's going on within your given scene. So having all these things, having your needs within each given player with the characters to the left of you and to the right of you, having at least one need for your character is important, but also as a group for your playset, have one object and or one location decided. You're going to have a complete setup. You're going to have an interesting set of things going on, and hopefully have a good fiasco.